Learning how to avoid disappointment in the sword community is an important skill which I think can be useful to practice and hone to make sure that you preserve your mental well-being when looking for information or trying to engage in this passion. Of course, if you've been practicing this hobby for a while, you are probably well aware of everything I'm going to say here. And not to say that there's going to be any groundbreaking revelations or anything. It's just a couple of tips, I think, for people coming into this hobby that may not know what to expect from the community. You may think, in fact, that such a niche hobby with such a specific focus would be kind of a one environment where people share information, opinions, and thoughts, and that kind of ends there. But as I mentioned in my previous video, when I talked about where to find sword communities and kind of the platforms where you find them, the landscape is quite varied. And this is both in terms of the platforms on which people interact, but also the specific details that kind of inform the way their passion for swords manifests. So each community will have its own quirks, its own rules, but also its own kind of general vibe, you can say. And I think overall there are kind of three main directions people take when they become interested in swords. And of course this is very subjective, and each of these three directions can be broken down into a bunch of different subgroups, so to speak. It's, I think, with any hobby or passion, the fractioning of interest never ends, basically. However, you have the first, which is the more, perhaps we can call it like academic side of things. This is where people tend to discuss papers, books, historical objects, well, swords as historical objects, essentially. So you'll have a lot of talk about museum pieces, you'll have a lot of talk about recent papers, the process of ironwork, for example, the historical context in which swords were used. And in this kind of field, you'll find, generally speaking, academics, collectors. You may find a lot of reenactors too, and a lot of people who are involved like in living history or in trying to accurately portray events of history or objects of the past. The second approach to swords, I would say, is perhaps the one of the practitioner. So these are the communities where all people who are interested in actual practical use of swords will kind of converge to. These will be HEMA communities, but we can even move outside of European sword-related martial arts, and you'll find, of course, communities of people using traditional Japanese blades or methods, or any person who is interested in general in kind of training or recreating any kind of martial art all over the world, which involves the use of swords or weapons in general. The focus of these communities is often way more practical. They're sharing information about footwork, handling a sword, specific ways, a specific kind of cut, specific stances. It's way more almost sport related in a sense. So you'll see a change in lexicon and terminology people speak, and also the things people are interested in, for example. So when it comes to historical sources, for instance, there may be less attention put towards the general historical context in which a sword was used, for instance, or let's say the cultural aspects of sword design, and more focus may be placed instead on historical documents that kind of train and explain how to use the object or the sword, of course. The third approach is more, I would call it the pop culture approach, perhaps, and this tends to attract people who are interested in swords for a broad variety of reasons, but generally speaking, we're talking about people who perhaps get interested in swords because of video games, because of seeing them in some movies or franchises or TV series, or in some of the big fantasy franchises like Lord of the Rings, or I don't know what other ones, because I'm not really into fantasy that much. And what you have here tends to be more discourse around speculation about how certain fantasy designs would work in a potentially real context, how certain fantasy designs may relate to real weapons, how, for instance, realistic combat dynamics may be in a game, or how realistic or how we can criticize or critique certain combat scenes in movies or shows, for instance. Of course, as I mentioned, each one of these three approaches can be broken down then into multiple subgroups. So within the pop culture kind of approach, you'll find people who are still more tied to realism and kind of the critique of historical accuracy in media. But you may also find the completely disconnected from reality, and I don't mean it in a judgmental way, but like the purely speculative, rooted in the world of fantasy approach. At the same time, for instance, in the more practitioner or sport approach I mentioned, you can easily bleed into reenactment and LARPing, for instance. But there may also be really different focuses in terms of how people who are interested in HEMA, for instance, approach the practice. So for some, it may really be seen as a competitive sport, first and foremost. For others, it may be more of a way to practice techniques from the past, so the interest may be still more historical. And of course, at the same time, even in the first, the more academic group I mentioned, you may have actually pure academics who are releasing, for instance, papers or studies, or you may have groups of collectors who are, yes, interested in the historical aspect of things, but their main goal may be simply to obtain or have as many swords as they can, for instance. And of course, each one of these subgroups can break down into more and more specific interests. Some are really into measurement, some are really into restoration, some are writing a fantasy book and are simply looking for tips and tricks on how to describe a weapon. So there's a whole wide, vast gamut of reasons why people approach swords. And this can kind of be a little bit jarring or disappointing, especially when you don't know your way in the community, or probably I should say in the communities, because you may join certain groups and then quickly realize that what you thought would be a shared interest is really not the core focus of that group. I know I had that feeling when I first started interacting with the sword subreddit. I was kind of lurking for a long while. And I think I asked once whether people were more interested in antiques or in reproduction swords. And my expectation, honestly, was that everyone would be interested in antiques, because in my mindset and in the way I approach swords, those are real swords in the sense that they are actually built for use. They were built in a time in which swords were used. So let's say in my mindset at the time, without experience of all the different facets of the community, I expected it to be a resounding, like, yeah, we're really into antique swords. And I was really surprised when the majority of comments instead, or maybe it was a poll, I don't remember, but the majority, and not by a small margin, was really more into reproduction swords. So of course, it doesn't have to be a disappointment when you realize that the community doesn't necessarily match what your expectations are, but it can be. And it's important to know also that the different aspects of the sword community tend to group on different platforms. And this is perhaps also due to demographic reasons and the kind of people who populate specific platforms. So for instance, and this is my experience, I'm not saying it's universally true, but you'll see that the pop culture crowd tends to gravitate more around Reddit, TikTok perhaps, and the academic group of people, so to speak, or the collectors especially, you'll find them way more present on Facebook, for example. The practitioners you'll find a little everywhere, I would say, and everyone is basically present on YouTube. And this is not to say that one platform is better than another or anything like that. It's simply, I think, useful for, especially for people kind of moving into the community for the first times, to be able to understand where they can find exactly the kind of sword discourse they're looking for. And then, of course, it's always cool to branch out and discover new ways of approaching something that we like. Because one thing that needs to be mentioned, perhaps, is that now I mentioned these three approaches and a few of their subgroups, but don't get the impression that these kind of live in separate worlds. There's a lot of overlap. So for instance, the person who's really into reenactment can easily be found both in the academic reenactment community. It can be a practitioner who is a martial artist but also enjoys like full immersion in historical context, but it can obviously also be the LARP enthusiast or the pop culture enthusiast who enjoys going to a Renaissance fair, for instance. So there really is a lot of overlap in these communities, and this is really cool on the one hand because it enables you to see and learn different approaches to something that you enjoy, but it can also be confusing and difficult to address if you're trying to look for detailed information that kind of pertains to a specific field. So, of course, you may go to Reddit and ask for a certain question and then see a whole bunch of answers that slowly devolve into pop culture fantasy, for instance, which is maybe not what you were looking for. On the other hand, you may be wanting to talk about, I don't know, the last episode of some fantasy TV show, and suddenly you have a whole bunch of professors telling you about metalwork in the 11th century, which maybe is not what you're there for. This perhaps brings me to the last point in this video, which is that the people who contribute the most in the community, so who's creating content, who's providing answers on Reddit or on Facebook, who's really involved in, commenting and being active in the community, perhaps needs to think about who they are in terms of what kind of their main interest or main field of knowledge is, and then also think about how this fits in the different conversations they're having, so to speak. This isn't to gatekeep or to say that someone who's an academic should never drop into a pop culture debate or discussion, nor vice versa, of course. But the way we talk about swords or about their historical context really changes from one community to the other, really sometimes pretty dramatically too. And what is perfectly fine in a quick Discord conversation may not be equally fine in a serious conversation. And what may be great in an academic conversation may come off as really pedantic if you're talking about Lord of the Rings, for example. So while it's important for people who are joining the community to be able to orient themselves in the landscape of sword discourse and know where certain conversations that they are more interested are happening, I think it's equally important for the veterans, perhaps, or for the people that are really involved in kind of keeping that community up through the production of content and information to know when a certain message fits the conversation or when it should be either toned down or made more serious. So this is all I have to say. It's a quick PSA, I suppose. I'm interested in hearing from perhaps beginners, if this is useful to you, of course, but I'm also interested in hearing from veterans of the sword community, from all facets of it, whether you feel that what I've said in this video actually mirrors your own experience, or if maybe this is just something I feel or think, and and you don't. And enjoy the sword community, of course, because it's a really positive and welcoming environment, and the more, the merrier. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye!